So now we will discuss about British English and American English in Canada. Many scholars believe that in Canada, it has its own distinct and unique language, taken from both the British as well as from the American. As mentioned earlier, Canada is the second largest country in the world, and with that said, you are bound to get different varieties of English language, regardless of the investigation of all the immigrants that are arriving into the country, bringing their different varieties of English language. You can just look at Canada geographically and see how big and how many variations of the English language can be found. So the linguistic diversity, when critiquing Canadian English, there are some key factors that you must identify when looking at it linguistically. You must start by looking at how long a particular region of people have cohabitated within the region, because they tend to have a certain rhythm, a certain way that they do talk, and the way that they convey the English language. But there are other things you can take a look at in Canada especially as well, is the geographical barriers. When you just take the mountains, for instance, the Rocky Mountains, you just look at two groups that tended not to go from one to the other in the early 19th century. The mountains were just too vast to cross and too dangerous. So therefore, you did have different variations of English. Then you must look at the cultural attitude within the country and see if the language is transforming into a contemporary style. And that is something that I believe is happening. As the media starts to use younger language, the common language, or the proper English language, as one would say, tends to be a little too stuffy for the public. So you must look at the attitude within the country and see how the language is transforming, and how it's transforming away from less British and perhaps more American, because it is the American English vocabulary that is leading the way with all these new contemporary words that are being used in media, as well as calling certain technologies that are being introduced into society from the United States that had no words for it before. Again, as mentioned earlier, during the American Revolution, there was a mass exodus of British loyalists that left the United States and settled in eastern Canada, and a majority of these British loyalists had the English language that was already beginning to transform into American English. Because many of the loyalists had lived in the United States for some time, they began to inherently use American English. By the time they came into Canada, they introduced that kind of English. Now, this is the largest group of immigrants during this period of time that spoke this type of English. As well as you would be looking at is the British roots. Now, Canada has never forgot about their British roots. They do realize that the Americans are the neighbors to the south, but they do consider the British to be family. And when we're regarding the mother variety, it's difficult to say that is Canadian English more American or more British, because Canada does have a unique English due to the fact that it has its own dictionary, due to the fact that it uses its own words to describe things for instance, toque, which is a knitted hat. It's used nowhere else in the world other than in Canada. Then you can look at what Canadians use as OUR, for instance, spelling color. That's the way the British dictionary writes it, instead of the American, which is just OR. Americans like to use Z and E, but Canadians follow the British using S and E. And as I've said, that Canada is a very large country, and it has lots of migration that occurs from the east coast to the west and the west to the east. And within Canada, you are looking at different pockets of different types of Englishes, which is another phenomenon that you quite often happen to see, because as these migrations are occurring within Canada, the people who are moving from the east coast to the west want to speak like west coast Canadians. So therefore, they tend to hypercorrect as they speak. Unfortunately, many of them don't understand properly how to use the words, and through this hypercorrection, they tend to overuse the words incorrectly. This happens to be quite common because in the east coast of Canada is a little bit more British English. In the west coast of Canada tends to be more American English. And in between, it's called the prairies. And the prairies tend to have, again, their own type of English, which is more of a rural English. So it would be coming from makeshift cultures that are somewhat, let's call it a melting pot of Ukrainian, Polish, and some British, and some Irish. And they have their own spin on English language.